The grand cathedral of the Leaken High Council smelled of ancient stone, burning myrrh, and the suffocating, bitter tension of forced loyalty. It was a colossal architectural marvel, designed to make even the most powerful alphas feel like insignificant specks of dust beneath the gaze of the moon goddess. Towering stained glass windows cast long, fractured beams of blood red and gold light across the polished marble floor. The pews were packed with the reigning elites of the northern and southern territories, heavily armored warlords, and aristocratic pack leaders who held their breath in collective, agonizing anticipation. At the end of the long center aisle, kneeling on a velvet cushion at the base of the sacred altar, was Rhydian. He was a massive, imposing figure of lethal ambition. His broad shoulders were draped in the heavy, ceremonial crimson velvet of the supreme monarch, and his jet-black hair was slicked back, highlighting the sharp, predatory lines of his jaw. He kept his piercing amber eyes fixed on the High Elder standing above him. Today was the culmination of a lifetime of ruthless political maneuvering, violent conquest, and unspeakable sacrifices. Today, he would be officially crowned the Alpha King, the undisputed, supreme ruler of all Leaken territories. Standing a few paces behind him, radiating an aura of smug, aristocratic triumph, was his Luna, Isolde. She wore a gown of spun silver and white silk, dripping with diamonds that caught the cathedral light. She was the picture of highborn perfection, the daughter of the wealthiest pack in the East, chosen specifically to elevate Rhydian's political standing before the High Council. Yet, beneath Isolde's haughty, untouchable facade, an invisible rot was eating away at her sanity. For years, they had been mated for 4 years, and the royal union had yielded absolutely nothing. The grand nurseries in Rhydian's palace remained devastatingly empty. It was the darkest, most dangerous secret in the kingdom, a glaring vulnerability that the High Council had violently debated behind closed doors. By ancient law, a supreme Alpha King was required to present an heir to legitimize his dynasty. But Rhydian was too powerful, too terrifying to deny. He had forced this coronation through sheer intimidation and military leverage, bullying the council into crowning him despite his barren marriage. As the High Elder slowly raised the ancient, heavy gold and obsidian crown from its velvet pedestal, Rhydian felt a sudden, cold phantom ache in his chest. It was a memory, a violent, visceral flashback that he had spent 4 years trying to bury under the weight of his own ambition. As the shadow of the descending crown fell over his face, Rhydian's mind dragged him back to the freezing, torrential downpour of the courtyard. He remembered the mud. He remembered the heavy, crushing silence of his pack as he stood over Kaia, his fated mate. Kaia had been the woman the stars themselves had tethered to his soul. But 2 years into their mating, her womb had remained empty. The political pressure from the High Council had been mounting, demanding a legacy to secure his bid for the crown. Rhydian's ambition had eclipsed his soul. He had dragged Kaia before the entire assembly in the dead of night, her dark hair plastered to her face by the freezing rain. "I need an heir," Rhydian had told her, his voice a cold, unfeeling blade that cut through the thunder. "The council demands a legacy, Kaia. You are broken. You are barren. A supreme king cannot be anchored to a dead bloodline." He had publicly stripped her of her Luna title, his claws physically tearing the silver pack insignia from her clothing. He ignored the profound, agonizing fracture of their mating bond. To make way for the politically strategic mating with Isolde, he had banished his fated mate to the deadly rogue fringes, a brutal, lawless expanse of wilderness where exiled wolves went to starve, freeze, or be slaughtered by feral scavengers. It was an absolute death sentence, masked as a banishment. He had told himself it was the necessary, heavy price of absolute power. Rhydian blinked the ghost of the rain from his eyes, his jaw tightening as he returned to the reality of the cathedral. Kaia was a ghost, a forgotten casualty on his path to the throne. His sacrifice was about to be rewarded. By the blood of the ancients and the light of the moon goddess, the High Elder chanted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as he held the heavy obsidian crown directly over Rhydian's head. "We name you the supreme ruler of the wolves. We name you Alpha K." A catastrophic, deafening explosion of sound tore through the cathedral. The heavy, reinforced oak doors at the far end of the sanctuary did not just open. They violently shattered. Massive splinters of ancient wood and twisted iron hinges exploded inward, raining down upon the terrified nobles seated in the back pews. The concussive shockwave of the impact snuffed out the hundreds of ceremonial candles lining the aisle, plunging the cathedral into a sudden, chaotic gloom, illuminated only by the blinding rectangle of bright sunlight pouring through the ruined entrance. Gasps and shrieks erupted from the aristocracy. Heavily armored elite guards immediately drew their broadswords, the metallic screech of steel ringing through the echoing chamber. Rhydian shot to his feet, spinning around, his amber eyes flaring with lethal, defensive fury. Isolde let out a panicked cry, shrinking back against the altar. The High Elder froze, the crown hovering uselessly in his trembling hands. The dust from the shattered doors slowly began to settle, swirling violently in the shafts of sunlight. A silhouette stepped through the threshold. The entire cathedral descended into a dead, breathless silence. It was a woman, but she was not the broken, weeping, mud-stained girl Rhydian had thrown into the abyss 4 years ago. Kaia walked into the grand cathedral. She was a breathtaking, terrifying vision of untamed royalty. The rogue fringes had not killed her, they had forged her. She wore form-fitting armor crafted from dark, hardened leather and the thick pelts of apex predators. Intricate, bone-carved accents adored her shoulders and wrists. Her dark hair was braided wildly down her back, and her face was marked with the faint, silvery scars of impossible survival. But it was her posture that paralyzed the room. She did not walk like an exile returning to beg. She walked with the terrifying, absolute authority of a conquering queen marching into a besieged city. Rhydian felt the air violently leave his lungs. His heart stopped. "Kaia," he breathed, the name tasting like ash and ghost stories on his tongue. Isolde's face drained of all color, her hands flying to her mouth in absolute horror. The whispers in the pews ignited into a frantic, panicked wildfire as the older council members recognized the discarded Luna. Kaia stopped 30 paces down the center aisle, completely unbothered by the hundreds of drawn swords pointed in her direction. She looked directly at Rhydian, her eyes glowing with a cold, devastating fire. "You forgot to invite me to the coronation, Rhydian." Kaia's voice carried effortlessly through the cavernous room, sharp, melodic, and dripping with lethal mockery. "Guards!" Isolde shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. "Seize the exile. She is a rogue. Kill her." The royal guards took a hesitant step forward, their boots echoing loudly. "I wouldn't do that," Kaia warned softly, a dangerous, deeply satisfied smirk touching the corner of her mouth. She took a single, deliberate step to the side. As the sunlight fully illuminated the space behind her, 3 small figures stepped out from the swirling dust. The collective gasp from the High Council was so sharp it seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. Elite guards physically stumbled backward, their broadswords dipping toward the floor. Walking in perfect, terrifying, synchronized formation to flank their mother were 3 4-year-old boys. Rhydian's knees buckled. He actually had to reach out and grip the stone edge of the altar to keep from collapsing. The children were Rurik, Zev, and Kael, and they were flawless, undeniable, miniature mirrors of the Alpha King. They possessed the exact same jet black hair, the exact same sharp, aristocratic jawlines, and the exact same piercing, predatory amber eyes that Rhydian saw every time he looked in the mirror. They were dressed in dark, meticulously crafted rogue leathers, standing with a disciplined, lethal stillness that was completely unnatural for children their age. But it was not just their physical appearance that shattered the reality of the cathedral. It was the raw, unadulterated power bleeding off them. Even at 4 years old, the triplets radiated a heavy, suffocating shockwave of pure, untainted royal alpha dominance. Because there were three of them, perfectly identical in blood and spirit, their auras compounded, weaving together into a localized atmospheric pressure that was so intensely heavy it forced the dust in the air to violently settle to the floor. Rhydian stared at the three boys, his mind violently short-circuiting. The lie he had built his entire empire upon, the lie that had justified the cruelest act of his life, was instantly, publicly annihilated. "You told the kingdom I was broken." Kaia's voice echoed like a death knell in the silent cathedral, her gaze locking onto Rhydian's terrified, wide eyes. "You told the council my womb was empty. But as you can see, Alpha King." She placed her calloused hands gently on the shoulders of the two boys nearest to her, a fierce, protective mother flanked by her apex cubs. "You were sorely mistaken, and today, your illegitimate reign ends." The cathedral did not simply erupt. It fractured into a deafening, uncontrollable cacophony of absolute aristocratic panic. The reigning elites, warlords, and pack alphas who had been sitting in respectful silence seconds before were now on their feet, shouting over one another. Chairs were overturned. Heavy silk robes rustled violently as the nobility scrambled backward, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic political bomb that had just detonated in the center aisle. Isolde's shrill, hysterical screams pierced through the roar of the crowd. She was clawing at her own spun silver gown, her flawless, manicured facade entirely destroyed. "Witchcraft!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, diamond-adorned finger at the three boys. "It is dark magic. She is a rogue. Kill them. Slay the illusions before they curse the king." Rhydian stood frozen at the altar, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped, dying animal. He stared at the three boys, Rurik, Zev, and Kael. The resemblance wasn't just close. It was a terrifying, flawless mirror. The arrogant tilt of their chins, the broad set of their small shoulders, the exact, piercing shade of their amber eyes. It was like looking at three phantoms of his own childhood. But Rhydian's mind, poisoned by 4 years of absolute power and paranoia, desperately scrambled for a life raft. He could not accept that he had thrown away the ultimate prize. "Silence!" Rhydian roared, his voice magically amplified, shaking the ancient dust from the cathedral rafters. The nobility flinched, their voices dying down to a frantic, terrified murmur. Rhydian pointed an accusing, heavy finger at Kaia, his face twisting into a mask of tyrannical rage. "You dare bring rogue tricks into the sanctuary of the High Council? You spent 4 years starving in the fringes, consorting with hedge witches and dark magic. These are glamours. Phantoms conjured to halt my coronation." Kaia didn't flinch. She stood tall in her dark, scavenged armor, her arms crossed lazily over her chest. She looked at the panicked, blustering Alpha King with an expression of profound, unadulterated pity. "Phantoms don't cast shadows, Rhydian," she replied, her voice cutting through the heavy silence as she nodded toward the floor, where the sunlight clearly outlined the solid, undeniable forms of the three boys. "Enough." The word was spoken softly, but it carried the absolute, unyielding weight of ancient law. The High Elder stepped forward from the altar, carefully setting the heavy obsidian crown back onto its velvet pedestal. He was an ancient, withered wolf who had seen centuries of kings rise and fall. He looked down the aisle at Kaia, and then at the 3 miniature warriors flanking her. "The High Council does not crown a king based on illusions, nor do we deny a bloodline based on fear," the High Elder declared, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceilings. He raised a gnarled hand, gesturing to the shadows near the cathedral walls. "Summon the Sisterhood of the Sight." A collective gasp swept through the pews. The Sisterhood were the truth-seers of the realm, ancient, blind female wolves who could not be deceived by magic, glamour, or political lies. They saw the world entirely through the raw, unfiltered resonance of blood and aura. 2 elderly women, draped in heavy, ash-gray robes, stepped out from the shadows. Their eyes were milky white and sightless, but they moved with eerie, perfect precision down the marble steps of the dais. Walking directly toward Kaia, and the triplets. As the blind seers approached, the elite royal guards tightened their grips on their broadswords, fully expecting the rogue exiles to attack. But Kaia simply stepped back, offering her sons a subtle, encouraging nod. Rurik, Zev, and Kael did not cower. They did not hide behind their mother's legs like normal 4-year-old pups. Operating with a terrifying, synchronized hive mind, the three boys took a single step forward to meet the truth seers. The lead seer reached out her trembling, wrinkled hands, hovering them inches above the boy's dark hair. "Show us the truth of your blood, little ones," the blind woman whispered. The triplets did not speak. They simply opened the floodgates of their combined auras. The reaction was instantaneous, violent, and utterly breathtaking. A localized shockwave of pure, unadulterated royal alpha dominance exploded outward from the three boys. It was not a physical blast, but a massive shift in the atmospheric pressure of the cathedral. The air suddenly tasted of ozone and heavy rain. The sheer weight of their combined, untainted royal bloodline crashed over the room like a tidal wave. The elite royal guards, hardened killers who had survived brutal wars, gasped, their knees involuntarily buckling under the crushing gravity of the boy's aura. The heavy clanking of steel echoed through the cathedral as dozens of fully armored guards were forced down onto the marble floor, their heads bowing instinctively to the overwhelming presence of apex royalty. Even the High Elder had to grip the altar to steady himself. The two blind truth seers gasped, instantly dropping to their knees before the 4-year-old boys. Tears of profound reverence streamed down from their sightless eyes. "The blood sings," the lead seer wept, her voice trembling with religious awe. She turned her blind face toward the altar, her words acting as an executioner's blade to Rhydian's lies. "There is no magic here. There is no trick. The blood is pure. It is the blood of the first wolves. They are his, flesh of his flesh, bone of his bone. The king has 3 trueborn sons." The words hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. At the altar, the political dynamic of the entire kingdom violently, catastrophically flipped. Rhydian stared at the truth seers, the realization hitting him with the force of a falling mountain. Flesh of his flesh. The truth slammed into his chest, annihilating the darkest, most terrifying insecurity that had haunted him for the last 4 years. He wasn't the broken one. His seed was flawless. His bloodline was impossibly strong. The devastating, humiliating curse of the barren womb did not belong to him. Rhydian slowly turned his head to look at Isolde. The highborn Luna was still huddled against the altar, her face contorted in a mask of weeping, pathetic terror. The prestigious, untouchable aristocrat was nothing but an empty, infertile vessel. Rhydian's eyes, normally filled with possessive pride when he looked at her, instantly turned to a freezing, ruthless disgust. She had given him nothing but political headaches and bloody sheets. Then, the Alpha King turned his gaze back down the aisle, looking at the 3 boys standing proudly in front of their mother. The shock that had paralyzed him evaporated, entirely transmuted by a sudden, consuming surge of arrogant, possessive greed. 1 son would have secured his throne. 2 would have made his dynasty unassailable. But 3? 3 identical, pure-blooded royal alpha sons. It was a manifestation of divine power. It was an empire that would last 1,000 years. His legacy was infinitely, undeniably secure. He didn't care about the cruelty of his past. He didn't care that he had dragged their mother through the mud and left her to die. In his deeply toxic, narcissistic mind, he was the Alpha King. What belonged to his bloodline belonged to him by divine right. Rhydian smoothed the front of his crimson velvet robes, his chest puffing out as he adopted the magnanimous, benevolent mask of a forgiving monarch. He walked slowly down the marble steps of the dais, projecting his own massive aura to counter the heavy pressure in the room. "Kaia," Rhydian spoke, his tone dripping with a sickening, condescending warmth. He spread his arms wide as he stopped 10 paces from her. "You have performed a miracle. You survived the wastes, and you have kept my sons safe. You have done your duty to the crown." Kaia's amber eyes narrowed. her hand resting casually on her bone blade. She didn't say a word, letting the tyrant dig his own grave. "I am a merciful king," Rhydian continued, raising his voice so the High Council could hear his supposed benevolence. "Your exile is hereby lifted. I will pardon your rogue status. You may live in the outer palace walls, provided you do not interfere with the royal affairs of state." He held out a large, demanding hand. "Now, bring them to me. Hand over my heirs, so the coronation may proceed." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a blade. Kaia looked at his outstretched hand. Then, she looked up into his eyes, and she laughed. It was a cold, bitter, and terrifyingly dark sound that made the hairs on the back of Rhydian's neck stand up. "Live in the outer palace," Kaia repeated, her voice dripping with venomous disbelief. "You didn't misplace a favorite hunting hound, Rhydian. You publicly humiliated your fated mate. You stripped my mark, broke our bond, and threw a pregnant woman into the abyss to freeze to death so you could sleep with a barren aristocrat." Gasps erupted from the pews. No one spoke to the Alpha King that way. Rhydian's benevolent mask instantly violently cracked. His hand dropped to his side, curling into a massive, trembling fist. The public disrespect in front of the High Council and the noble houses was a direct threat to his absolute authority. His massive ego, inflamed by the greed of seeing his sons, demanded immediate, brutal submission. If she would not hand them over willingly, he would take them by force. He was their blood father. He was the supreme alpha. By ancient law, his command was absolute magic. "You forget who you are speaking to, rogue," Rhydian snarled, his voice dropping into a demonic, vibrating frequency that made the stained glass windows rattle. His amber eyes flared with a brilliant, blinding gold light as his inner wolf clawed its way to the surface. He expanded his massive chest, drawing upon the deepest, most ancient reserves of his tyrannical power, preparing to unleash the crushing, inescapable weight of the Alpha Command to physically force Kaia and the boys to their knees. "You will kneel," Rhydian roared, the magical shockwave ripping from his throat, directed entirely at his family. "You will kneel in the dirt, and you will give me my sons." The Alpha Command tore through the grand cathedral like a localized, invisible hurricane. The sheer atmospheric pressure of Rhydian's magical mandate was so overwhelmingly heavy that the massive stained glass windows vibrated dangerously in their lead frames. The heavy silk banners hanging from the vaulted ceiling snapped wildly. Caught in the crossfire, dozens of highborn nobles and aristocratic pack leaders were physically forced out of their pews, collapsing to their knees on the marble floor, gasping for breath against the collateral gravity of the king's absolute authority. The invisible, crushing wave of domination barreled down the center aisle, aimed directly at Kaia and the three small boys. It was designed to shatter their willpower, to force their bones to yield, and to drag them into absolute, humiliating submission at the tyrant's feet. But Rurik, Zev, and Kael did not yield. Moving with that same terrifying, synchronized hive mind, the 3-4-year-olds stepped directly in front of their mother. They did not cower. They did not cry out. Instead, they reached out and tightly linked their small, calloused hands together. The moment their fingers intertwined, their individual auras violently fused. The result was an impenetrable, monolithic fortress of pure, untainted royal alpha dominance. The air around the children literally rippled, distorting the light like heat rising off sun-baked asphalt, glowing with a faint, incandescent amber energy. Rhydian's Alpha Command slammed directly into that shield. The sound was like a massive sheet of thick ice catastrophically fracturing over a frozen lake. The magical mandate did not just fail. It violently shattered against the superior, concentrated purity of the Triplets' combined bloodline. The psychic feedback of the broken command hit Rhydian with the kinetic force of a swinging battering ram. The Alpha King was physically launched backward, his heavy boots skidding wildly across the polished marble dais. He collided heavily with the stone altar, clutching his chest and gasping for air as a thin trickle of dark blood leaked from his nose. His ultimate weapon, the absolute divine right of the king, had been effortlessly, humiliatingly broken by his own 4-year-old sons. The boys stood entirely unbroken in the center aisle, their linked hands firm. They looked up at the stumbling, bleeding tyrant, their piercing amber eyes completely devoid of the natural love or fear a child should hold for a father. "You threw our mother to the wolves." The triplets spoke in perfect, chilling unison. Their combined voices carried a deep, unnatural resonance that vibrated through the floorboards of the silent cathedral. "You are not our king." Rhydian leaned heavily against the altar, his chest heaving, his mind entirely paralyzed by the impossibility of what had just happened. Kaia stepped out from behind her sons. She did not look at the broken Alpha King. Instead, she turned her fierce, confident gaze upward, addressing the ancient High Elder who was watching the scene unfold with wide, horrified eyes. "You want to know how a pregnancy of this magnitude was hidden from the finest royal healers in the kingdom?" Kaia's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, echoing perfectly in the cavernous space. "You want to know why you all believed my womb was empty?" She began to walk slowly toward the dais, the triplets flanking her in perfect formation. The elite royal guards, still kneeling under the crushing weight of the boy's aura, parted like the Red Sea to let the true Luna pass. "The biological toll of carrying a single royal alpha is immense," Kaia explained, her words cutting through the tense silence. "To carry 3, it is a magical anomaly. The sheer, overwhelming power of these 3 apex souls was too massive for a single mortal frame to sustain under normal conditions. But that was not the only danger." Kaia stopped at the base of the marble steps. She shifted her amber eyes, locking them onto Isolde. The highborn Luna was trembling violently against the altar, her face entirely drained of blood, looking like a cornered rat. "My body did not just hide them. It went into a profound, biological dormancy to protect them," Kaia declared, her voice dropping into a lethal, venomous frequency. "To protect them from the toxic environment of this palace. And to protect them from the lethal, concentrated doses of liquid wolfsbane and silver ash that Lady Isolde had been secretly slipping into my morning teas for 6 months." A collective, deafening gasp ripped through the aristocracy. The High Elder's eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated outrage. Poisoning a royal bloodline was not just a crime. It was high treason of the most horrific order, punishable by immediate execution. "Lies!" Isolde shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically. She looked frantically around the room, reading the disgust and sudden murderous intent on the faces of the pack leaders. "She is a lying rogue. I am from the highest noble house. I would never." "You did," Kaia interrupted, her voice as hard as diamond. "My wolf felt the poison, Isolde. The magic of my sons neutralized it, masking their own life force to ensure you believed you had succeeded in rendering me barren. You manipulated an alpha king into breaking sacred Leaken law. You forced him to discard a fertile, fated mate for your own political greed." Kaia looked back at Rhydian, her expression filled with cold, absolute disgust. "And you, Rhydian, were arrogant and foolish enough to let her." The political architecture of the entire kingdom was crumbling in real time. Rhydian had broken the most sacred law of the moon goddess by casting out a fertile mate, invalidating his claim to the supreme throne. Isolde had committed high treason. The coronation was officially a crime scene. Realizing that her life, her position, and her pristine aristocratic reputation were completely, irrevocably destroyed, Isolde snapped. The fragile, haughty aristocrat completely lost her mind. She descended into a state of feral, cornered panic. She pointed a trembling, diamond-clad finger at Kaia and the boys, screaming at the top of her lungs to her personal, high-born elite guards who had traveled with her from the Eastern Territories. "Kill them! Kill the bastards!" Isolde shrieked, her face twisting into a demonic mask of pure hatred. "Tear the witch to pieces. They are rogues. Slay them." 10 heavily armored elite guards from Isolde's noble house, bound by blood oath to protect her, drew their weapons. They were highly trained, parade ground soldiers who operated on blind loyalty. With a collective roar, They charged down the dais steps, their heavy broadswords raised, aiming directly for the 4-year-old boys. Rhydian was too stunned, too physically and mentally crippled by the shattered Alpha command to intervene. The High Elder shouted for the royal guards to stop them, but they were still pinned to the floor by the Triplets' aura. Kaia did not panic. She did not scream for help. "Hold the line, my sons," Kaia ordered softly. Rurik, Zev, and Kael stood perfectly still, their linked hands glowing brighter, their combined aura creating an invisible wall of heavy pressure that instantly slowed the charging guards, making them move as if they were wading through deep mud. Kaia stepped past her children. For years in the deadly rogue fringes had stripped away every ounce of the soft, palace-bred Luna. She had fought feral scavengers over scraps of meat. She had survived brutal, freezing winters with 3 infants strapped to her chest. She was a weapon forged in the absolute worst conditions the world had to offer. She drew her heavy, bone-carved blade from her thigh sheath. It wasn't elegant steel, it was a jagged, brutal tool of survival. The first noble guard swung his broadsword in a wide, clumsy arc aimed at her neck. Kaia ducked effortlessly under the blade, stepping directly inside his guard. She drove the heavy bone pommel of her weapon directly into his armored knee with bone-shattering force. The guard screamed, collapsing instantly. Before he hit the floor, Kaia pivoted, driving her elbow brutally into the throat of the second guard, crushing his windpipe and sending him crashing backward down the marble steps. It wasn't a duel, it was a systematic, humiliating dismantling. She moved with terrifying, fluid, apex efficiency. A third guard lunged. She caught his wrist, twisted it until the bone snapped with a loud crack, and used his own momentum to throw him into 2 of his charging comrades. She parried a heavy thrust from a 6th guard, stepping into his blind spot and delivering a devastating, localized strike to his jaw that rendered him unconscious before he even realized he had been hit. In less than 30 seconds, 10 of the highest trained, most expensive aristocratic elite guards in the Eastern Territories were groaning, bleeding, or unconscious on the polished marble floor of the cathedral. Kaia stood in the center of the carnage, her breathing completely even, not a single drop of sweat on her brow. She slowly wiped the bone blade clean on the velvet cloak of a fallen guard. She looked up the steps of the dais, her fierce, unyielding amber eyes locking onto the terrified, weeping form of Isolde and the completely broken, paralyzed Alpha King. She had not just proven her fertility. She had effortlessly, undeniably established her absolute physical dominance in front of the entire kingdom. "I am the true Luna of this bloodline," Kaia declared, her voice ringing out with terrifying, absolute authority over the moans of the defeated guards. She sheathed her blade and looked directly at the High Elder. "And I have come to claim what belongs to my sons." The silence that descended upon the grand cathedral was no longer the heavy, breathless anticipation of a coronation. It was the suffocating, terrifying quiet of an execution. Kaia stood amidst the groaning bodies of the Eastern elite guards, her breathing perfectly even, the bone-carved blade resting safely in its sheath. She did not look like a rogue exile who had just survived an assassination attempt. She looked like the wrath of the moon goddess made flesh. The ancient marble floor of the sanctuary was smeared with the blood of the men who had dared to raise steel against the true royal bloodline, and not a single noble in the pews dared to utter a word. The High Elder slowly descended the final steps of the dais. He bypassed the weeping, pathetic form of Isolde entirely, his ancient, milky eyes locked onto Alpha Rhydian. Rhydian was still leaning against the stone altar, his chest heaving, wiping the thin trail of dark blood from his nose. He looked at the High Elder, his golden eyes wide with a desperate, frantic plea. He was seconds away from the ultimate crown. He had spent his entire life orchestrating this exact moment. "Elder," Rhydian rasped, his voice sounding hollow and remarkably small in the cavernous room. "You saw her. She attacked the royal guard. She is a rogue. The boys are my blood. Yes, but she is unfit. Give me my crown, and I will take my sons and restore order to this." "Do not speak," the High Elder commanded. The ancient wolf did not shout, but his voice carried the crushing, unyielding weight of 1,000 years of sacred Leaken law. The High Elder stopped in front of Rhydian. He reached out with gnarled, trembling hands and picked up the heavy, gold and obsidian crown from the velvet pedestal. Rhydian instinctively bowed his head, letting out a ragged sigh of relief, expecting the ancient ritual to proceed despite the chaos. He assumed his bloodline was so undeniable that the council would forgive the bloodshed. But the crown did not descend onto Rhydian's head. Instead, the High Elder clutched the ancient artifact to his chest and took a deliberate, highly symbolic step backward, physically distancing the supreme authority of the kingdom from the Alpha. "You have broken the first laws, Rhydian of the Western Plains," the High Elder declared, his voice ringing out with absolute, damning finality. "You stood before the moon goddess and severed a fated bond forged by the stars themselves. You falsely branded a fertile mate as barren, prioritizing political greed over the sanctity of the soul. You banished the true vessel of the royal bloodline to the lethal fringes, leaving 3 trueborn heirs to freeze in the mud." Rhydian's head snapped up, a cold, paralyzing dread flooding his veins. "I didn't know," he argued desperately, his hands gripping the edges of the altar. "She hid them from me. If I had known she carried my sons. If you had known, you would have taken the children and slaughtered the mother to make room for your aristocratic whore," the High Elder interrupted, his milky eyes flashing with profound disgust. The Elder gestured toward the trembling form of Isolde. "And in your supreme arrogance, you brought a traitor to the highest altar in the land. A woman who poisoned your fated mate, attempting to assassinate the royal heirs in the womb. You allowed her guards to draw steel against the bloodline in this very sanctuary." The High Elder turned his back on Rhydian, facing the hundreds of terrified nobles, warlords, and pack alphas gathered in the pews. "The High Council does not crown cowards, and we do not bow to traitors," the High Elder's voice boomed, magically amplified to reach every corner of the cathedral. "Rhydian's claim to the supreme throne is hereby rendered void. He is stripped of the title of Alpha King. His right to rule is dissolved, effective immediately." "No!" Rhydian roared, the sound tearing from his throat in a raw, animalistic howl of pure agony. He lunged forward, desperately reaching for the obsidian crown. "You cannot do this. I have the largest army. I hold the territories. I am the king." Before Rhydian could take a second step, a wall of massive, heavily armored royal guards, the very men who had been pinned to the floor by the triplets a moments ago, surged forward. They did not raise their swords to defend Rhydian. They raised their heavy steel shields, forming an impenetrable barricade between the disgraced Alpha and the High Elder. The guards' loyalties had instantly shifted. They served the crown and the true bloodline, and Rhydian was now officially neither. Rhydian crashed against the wall of shields, his claws violently sparking against the steel, but the guards shoved him backward with brutal, unfeeling force, knocking him to his knees on the marble steps. "Arrest the false Luna," the High Elder commanded, pointing a single, bony finger at Isolde. 2 massive royal executioners stepped past the shield wall. Isolde shrieked, kicking and thrashing wildly as the heavily armored men grabbed her by the arms of her spun silver gown. They dragged her effortlessly across the marble floor. "Rhydian, save me. Command them," Isolde screamed, her aristocratic facade entirely replaced by the hysterical terror of a woman realizing she was about to face the executioner's block for high treason. Rhydian did not look at her. He remained on his knees, his eyes locked desperately on the obsidian crown, his chest heaving with manic, hyperventilating breaths. He was tethered to a disgraced, barren traitor, and his entire empire had just evaporated into thin air. The High Elder slowly walked down the marble steps, moving past the barricade of shields, until he stood directly in front of Kaia and the 3 boys. The ancient wolf slowly, painfully lowered himself onto one knee, bowing his head before the 4-year-old triplets. Behind him, following the High Elder's lead, the hundreds of nobles, pack leaders, and warlords in the pews stood up, turned toward the aisle, and dropped to their knees in absolute, synchronized submission. The bloodline is secure, the High Elder proclaimed, looking up at Rurik, Zev, and Kael. The boys stood perfectly still, their dark silver eyes calm and calculating, absorbing the absolute surrender of an entire kingdom without a flinch. The council recognizes these three trueborn sons as the undisputed, supreme heirs to the Leaken territories. When they come of age, the crown shall be theirs. The High Elder then shifted his gaze to Kaia. The profound respect in his ancient eyes was undeniable. She had not just survived, she had protected the future of their entire species against impossible odds. But until the day they can bear the weight of the crown, the High Elder continued, his voice echoing with profound reverence. The kingdom requires a ruler. We offer the throne to the mother who bled for the future. Kaia of the rogue fringes, we ask you to ascend as the queen regent. Rule this empire in their name, until the boys are ready to lead. Kaia looked down at the High Elder, and then out at the sea of kneeling, terrified aristocrats who had shunned her 4 years ago. She felt the small, strong hands of her sons gripping her fingers. This was what she had fought for. This was what she had starved for in the freezing mud of the fringes. I accept, Kaia said, her voice smooth, cold, and echoing with the absolute authority of a true monarch. From his place on the cold marble floor behind the shield wall, Rhydian watched his reality completely disintegrate. The crown, the ultimate power, the legacy, it was all being handed to the woman he had discarded. The manic desperation finally broke him. Rhydian scrambled around the edge of the shield barricade, crawling on his hands and knees over the blood-stained marble toward Kaia. The elite guards moved to intercept him, but Kaia raised a single hand, halting them. Rhydian stopped at the hem of her dark, scavenged leather armor. He looked up at her, tears of profound, agonizing regret streaming down his face. Kaia, please, Rhydian wept, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. The terrifying, tyrannical alpha was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow shell of a man. I was blind. The ambition poisoned my mind. But you are my fated mate. The bond is still there, buried deep. We can rule together. You are the queen, and I am the father of your sons. We can rebuild. Forgive me. Please, forgive me. He reached out a trembling hand, desperately trying to touch the leather of her boot, begging for a single scrap of the love she had once freely given him. Kaia looked down at him. There was no anger in her amber eyes. There was no hatred. There was only the cold, bottomless indifference of a predator looking at a decaying carcass. The bond is dead, Rhydian, Kaia said softly, her words completely devoid of emotion. You killed it in the freezing rain 4 years ago. You tore it from my soul when you stripped my mark. She gently pulled her boot back, ensuring his trembling fingers only grasped empty air. You do not get to claim the harvest after you salted the earth, Kaia continued, her voice carrying a terrifying, absolute finality. She looked down at her 3 sons. Rurik, Zev, and Kael stared at the weeping man on the floor with identical expressions of cold, apex disgust. You are not their father. You are merely the sperm that the moon goddess used to bypass a broken king. You are nothing to me, and you will be nothing to them. She did not wait for his response. Kaia turned her back on the ruined alpha. Holding the hands of her 3 royal alpha sons, the true queen of the Leaken territories walked up the marble steps toward the altar. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral remained shattered behind them, letting the pure, blinding sunlight flood into the ancient sanctuary. Rhydian was left weeping on the floor, stripped of his title, his army, and his legacy, entirely ignored by the kingdom he had sacrificed his soul to rule. His illegitimate reign had ended in absolute chaos, and the throne finally belonged to the bloodline he had tried to erase. But what do you think? Would you have crashed the coronation to take back the kingdom that was stolen from you? Or would you have stayed hidden in the fringes with your sons? Did Alpha Rhydian get exactly what he deserved for discarding his fated mate? Or was his ultimate humiliation too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this epic tale of a Baron Luna's ultimate revenge, the mind-blowing reveal of royal triplets, and the absolute destruction of a toxic alpha king, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow shifter romance fans. And if you want to see more stories where the exiled underdog returns to claim the ultimate throne, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next epic tale.